It all started a few weeks ago when I went to see my doctor about the headaches I'd been having. They were these dull, throbbing pains behind my eyes that just wouldn't go away no matter how much ibuprofen I took. The doctor ran some tests, but couldn't find anything wrong. "It's likely just stress," he said while scribbling something on his prescription pad. "Try this medication out and let me know if the headaches persist." I took the slip of paper from him and squinted to read his messy handwriting. "Neuroxetol?" I said. "Never heard of it." "It's new. Should help with the pain and tension," he replied casually. I shrugged and filled the prescription on my way home. The pharmacist raised his eyebrows at the unusual drug name, but said nothing as he handed me the bottle. I probably should have been more curious, but I was too exhausted from the headaches to think twice. I just wanted them to stop. The first week on Neuroxetol was uneventful. If anything, it only made the headaches worse. I considered going back to the doctor to ask for something different, but then the hallucinations started. The first time I was washing dishes and thought I saw someone standing in the backyard, right up against the window. I jumped and dropped a plate, shattering it on the floor, but when I looked again, no one was there. I wrote it off as a trick of the light and cleaned up the mess, tossing the broken dish in the trash. But that wasn't the last of the illusions. Over the next few days, dark shadows crept along the edges of my vision. I'd catch fleeting glimpses of figures scurrying by doorways, only to find nothing there when I turned my head. Strange noises filled the silence: breathing, footsteps, whispered voices. My hands started to shake and my heart raced every time I thought I wasn't alone. I couldn't focus on work. I stopped sleeping well. I even went to see an optometrist, thinking there was something wrong with my eyes. But my vision was apparently fine. It wasn't until I was halfway through the Neuroxetol bottle that I pieced it together. The hallucinations had started right after I began taking the new medication. As disturbing as they were, the mysterious figures and sounds had to be a side effect of the drug. I decided to stop taking it and made an appointment to tell my doctor. But the soonest opening was a week away. I just have to ride it out until then. Those 7 days crept by in a fog of anxiety and fear. The illusions were steadily getting worse, happening multiple times a day now. Shadowy beings darted constantly in my peripheral vision. I heard creepy whispers when I was home alone. And on more than one occasion, I swore I could feel an icy breath on the back of my neck, or an unseen hand graze my arm. By the night before my doctor's appointment, I was terrified of being alone. The minute I got home from work, I locked myself in the bedroom. I dragged a chair in front of the door for good measure, barricading myself in. Exhausted from stress, I fell into a fitful sleep, but I awoke a few hours later to a loud thump out in the hallway. Heart pounding, I scrambled out of bed and pressed my ear against the door. Someone, or something, was right outside in the dark hall, shuffling slowly along the floorboards. I held my breath, praying it would pass by my room. But then the shuffling stopped, right on the other side of the door. There was a long pause. Then I heard it. The distinct sound of fingernails scratching lightly on the wooden door, like whatever sinister presence was out there was taunting me, letting me know my barricade wouldn't keep it out. I clasped my hand over my mouth, stifling a shriek. The scratching continued, then stopped abruptly. Heavy silence. Had it left? I waited, frozen. Then, bam! The door shook violently as something slammed into it. Bam! Again. My chair rattled. The doorknob twisted violently. Screaming, I looked around in a panic for an escape. I spotted the window above my bed. As the door shook with another deafening blow, I scrambled onto the mattress and frantically tore open the window. Without looking back, I climbed out onto the dark, slanted roof outside my second-floor bedroom. The roof's edge was just a few feet away. I inched towards it on my hands and knees, peering over. It wasn't too far down to the ground below. Behind me, I heard the bedroom door splinter open with a final crash. There was an inhuman snarl from inside the room. Gasping in terror, I slid myself over the roof's edge, dangling off for a moment before dropping onto the grass below. I landed hard on my back. The wind knocked out of me for a second. Wheezing, I dragged myself to my feet and limped away across the shadowy lawn. Not even sure where I was going, just away from that thing inside my house. I made it halfway down the block. wheezing and crying before I collapsed in a heap on the sidewalk. Everything hurt, and I was still struggling to catch my breath. But at least I'd escaped. As I sat there shaking on the curb, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. The medication had made me hallucinate some unnatural intruder in my home, one so vivid and threatening that I jumped from a 2-story window to escape. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually I managed to pull myself together enough to get up and start walking again. I had to get farther away, be anywhere but near that house and the monstrous delusion within it. I walked all night, aimlessly wandering the streets until sunrise. When morning came, I went straight to my doctor's office, getting there just as they opened. I told the receptionist it was an emergency. She took one look at my disheveled, battered appearance and put me right into a room to see the doctor. When he came in, I tearfully recounted everything: the headaches, the Neuroxetol prescription, the horrifying hallucinations. "You have to help me," I pleaded, voice shaking. "That medication, it's doing something terrible to my mind." The doctor frowned in concern and stepped out to look up the drug. He returned a few minutes later, even more grim-faced than before. "Neuroxetol," he said slowly. "It was never approved for public use. Where did you get it?" My mind spun. "You prescribed it to me? For my headaches, remember?" He shook his head. "I've never even heard of it, much less prescribed it." Cold dread washed over me. If the doctor didn't give me Neuroxetol, then who did? And why? I dug the pill bottle out of my pocket with fumbling fingers. The doctor took it from me, inspecting the label closely. His eyes went wide. "This medication is linked to a series of clinical trials from the 60s, he said carefully. "The study was abruptly ended after patients reported experiencing vivid, dangerous hallucinations just like you described." He looked up at me, pale. "All of the trial participants had to be institutionalized after taking this. 5 ultimately committed suicide because of the terrifying illusions it induced." I stared at him in horror as he continued. "This drug was deemed unsafe decades ago and never approved. All samples were said to have been destroyed. So I have no idea how you got this bottle." His voice was grim. "But I can say without doubt that you are extremely lucky to be alive right now." I left the doctor's office in a daze that morning with strict orders to flush the remainder of the pills down the toilet. My visions did begin to subside over the next few days as the drug worked its way out of my system. But I still have no answers as to how I ended up with such a dangerous illicit medication. I never saw that doctor again. Whoever gave me the Neuroxetol succeeded in disappearing without a trace. I still have no idea who was behind it, or why I was apparently chosen as their unwitting test subject. And after the nightmarish hallucinations I endured, I'm honestly not sure I want to know. My sister has been locked in her room for days, speaking a language no one understands. I can hear her scratching at the walls. It started about a week ago. My sister Alice, who is 16 years old, didn't come down for breakfast one morning. My mom knocked on her door to check on her, but there was no answer. We figured maybe she was tired or not feeling well. But when it got to be lunchtime and she still hadn't come out, my mom used her key to open the door. Alice was just sitting on her bed staring at the wall. She didn't even look over when my mom called her name. My mom walked up to her and put a hand on her shoulder, which finally made Alice turn her head. But when she did, my mom jumped back in shock. Alice's eyes were completely white. No pupil, no iris, just milky white all over. She opened her mouth like she was going to say something, but all that came out was this creepy gibberish that didn't sound like any human language. It almost hurt to listen to it, like nails on a chalkboard. My mom asked Alice what was wrong, but she just kept making those horrible sounds. My mom called my dad up and they both tried talking to her, but she was completely unresponsive. They decided to take her to the hospital just in case something medical was going on, like a stroke or seizure. The doctors did some tests but found nothing physically wrong with Alice. They suggested she might be having a mental break or experiencing psychosis. They wanted to admit her to the psychiatric ward for observation. My parents reluctantly agreed. Things only got worse from there. The hospital would call my parents saying Alice was screaming and scratching at the walls so hard that her fingernails were bleeding. She would drag her fingernails down the wall, making these horrible scraping sounds, all the while babbling in that weird language. The nurses had to keep her hands bandaged so she wouldn't hurt herself. After a few days, the doctors said there was nothing more they could do and were going to transfer her to a long-term psychiatric facility. My parents refused and brought Alice home. They set up her bedroom so there was padding on the walls and nothing she could use to hurt herself. She had become skeletal thin from not eating any food. My mom tried spoon-feeding her, but Alice just spit it out. I can hear Alice's creepy scratching and mumbling through the walls as I sit in my room next to hers. My parents take turns sitting outside her door in case she tries to escape. The doctors gave her sedatives, but they didn't seem to have any effect on her mania. I miss having my real sister around. We used to be so close, but now it's like she's possessed. Last night I thought I heard other voices mixed in with Alice's weird language. I crept outside her door and listened closely. It definitely sounded like there were multiple people talking in strange whispers. I couldn't tell what they were saying, but it gave me chills up my spine. I finally got the courage to ask my mom if I could go into the room instead of her tonight. She was hesitant, but eventually agreed, telling me to call for her immediately if anything happened. As I sit here outside the door, I can feel my heart beating fast with anticipation and fear of what I might experience. Taking a deep breath, I slowly open the door. The stench hits me first, a mix of sweat and something rotten. I gag and cover my mouth, peering into the darkness. In the sliver of light coming from the hall, I can make out Alice's skeletal form hunched in the corner. Her bandaged fingers are shredding the padding on the wall as she babbles away in her creepy language. I whisper her name, but she doesn't react at all, just keeps scraping at the wall, ripping the padding to shreds. As I get closer, I notice the wooden wall underneath is scratched and gouged from her frantic digging. Some of the scratches form odd shapes and symbols that I don't recognize. Stopping a few feet away, I whispered Alice's name again, pleading with her to talk to me. The strange whispers seem louder now that I'm in the room. It's like they are coming through the walls. I think I even hear low laughter beneath the alien words. Goosebumps break out all over my skin as Alice's babbling gets even louder and faster. She starts clawing more violently at the wall, shredding her fingernails. Dark blood smears the strange symbols she has carved into the wood. As I'm about to yell for my mom, Alice suddenly stops. Slowly, she turns her head all the way around until she's looking at me over her shoulder. My heart leaps into my throat when I see her eyes are no longer white. Instead, they are now glowing red and filled with an awareness I haven't seen since she first locked herself in this room. When she opens her mouth this time, the voice that comes out chills me to my core. It's deep and guttural, nothing like my sister's voice. The words are no longer gibberish either. This time, in perfect English, the voice says, "Sister, we've been waiting for you." Those were the last words I heard before everything went black. I passed out from fear and shock. When I opened my eyes again, I was in my bed with my parents sitting beside me, looking worried. Apparently, I had screamed loud enough to make my mom come running and find me unconscious on the floor of Alice's bedroom. But Alice herself was no longer there. The room was empty, her shredded bedroom wall now just a dark, gaping hole. There was no blood or any other sign of Alice, though. She had simply vanished without a trace, along with whoever, or whatever else was in that room with her. My parents are distraught and have searched everywhere but found no clues to Alice's disappearance. I've told them about the creepy voices and seeing Alice's glowing red eyes right before I passed out, but they think I was hallucinating or having a nightmare. But I know what I saw. And I know those things in the room took my sister. I can still feel their presence close by, waiting to come back for me next. But I won't let them. I'm going to find out where they took Alice if it's the last thing I do. I just hope I'm not too late to save her. It started a few days ago. At first, I thought maybe some food had spoiled in the fridge or something, but when I checked, everything seemed fine. Still, this faint but putrid smell lingered in the house. I figured maybe a rat or squirrel had gotten trapped and died in the walls. Gross, yes, but not unheard of, especially with an old house like ours. The stench came and went over the next couple of days. Sometimes I'd notice it was worse in the kitchen, other times the living room. I did a thorough cleaning just in case, but still couldn't pinpoint the source. Then last night, As I headed to bed, I walked by the garage door and the smell hit me like a ton of bricks. Rancid and sickly sweet. No doubt about it, something had died in there. My first thought was that maybe my husband had forgotten to take the trash out before he left on his business trip. But peering into the empty bin, nothing seemed too off. Just typical household garbage. Certainly not the cause of the increasingly nauseating stench. I considered opening the garage to find the source, but something stopped me. A tight, nervous feeling in my gut whispering, "Don't." Perhaps it was intuition, telling me that some things are better left unknown. So I shoved some towels under the garage door crack, hoping to block the smell, and tried to put it out of my mind. Easier said than done. All night, my sleep was plagued by unsettling dreams of dark, decaying things hidden in shadowy corners, watching me. I'd wake in a cold sweat only to smell that sickly sweet rot invading the house once again. By morning, the stench permeated everything. In the kitchen brewing coffee, it was all I could smell. In my closet, picking out clothes, the rot clung to the fabric. Even standing outside to get fresh air, the heavy sweetness felt inescapable. I called my husband to ask if he'd left food scraps somewhere, but he swore nothing had been out of the ordinary when he left. He suggested I call an exterminator or someone to check the garage, but my unease persisted. Something in my core whispered, "Do not look inside." As the day dragged on, I grew more anxious. I started noticing flies gathering by the dozens on the garage door and windows. Their incessant buzzing filled me with a sense of lurking doom. By nightfall, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know the source of this invading, rotten stench. Gripping my flashlight tightly, I approached the garage door. The house was silent except for the whirring wings of the flies. With trembling hands, I punched in the code to open the garage door. It rumbled upward slowly, gratingly. The flashlight beam cut through the dark, revealing nothing at first. Just the familiar clutter of storage boxes and tools. I was about to step inside when I heard it. Deep within the garage was a wet, snapping sound followed by an awful squelching noise. Paralyzed by fear and the overpowering stench, I listened as more sickening sounds echoed out. Some primal instinct told me to run, get away from here as fast as I could. Instead, I grabbed an old rake leaning by the door to use as a weapon against whatever horror lurked within. Creeping closer, the flashlight revealed a trail of dark stains leading to a large mass draped by a tarp. With trembling hands, I gripped the tarp's edge, bracing myself for a glimpse of the source. The rotting smell was unbearable now. With a scream, I ripped the tarp away to reveal the nightmarish sight hidden beneath. A skinned carcass, decayed innards spilling out, twisted limbs, missing chunks of flesh, glassy eyes staring without sight, and writhing within the rib cage cavity were the maggoty masses, feasting wetly on their putrid host. I scrambled back, dropping the flashlight. Heart pounding with terror, I could now only think of escaping this gruesome garage scene, but I froze at the sound of a dark chuckle coming from the darkness behind me, followed by an inhuman rasp. "You should have listened when the stench first warned you. Now this rot will seep into your very soul." I did not turn to look. I barely made it back inside the house before violent convulsions seized my body, accompanied by the feeling of decay creeping through my veins. The rot had found its new host, and now my own horrific transformation was only just beginning. There are fates far worse than death.